this one, please sign up for our mailing list by going to our website, the Wayne Moore Center for Law and Politics. I'd like to thank the co-sponsors at the University of Oregon who are generously supporting this event. They include the Department of Philosophy, the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies, and the Center for the Study of Women in Society. I'd also like to thank the absolutely amazing members of the Wayne Moore Center team, Thea Croman, Rebecca Dinwoody Flynn, Abby Stilley, Dan Titchener, and Christine Waite. We are especially grateful to the many members of the Wayne Moore Circle who are here with us. Circle members provide critical support for our programs through annual donations in any amount, large or small. Please consider supporting our work by becoming a Wayne Moore Circle member. We are celebrating our 20th anniversary this year and look forward to bringing programs like this one to you for at least another 20. Now it's my honor to introduce today's speaker. Françoise Baylis is the 2020-21 Wayne Moore's Chair of Law and Politics. Professor Baylis is a philosopher and university research professor at Dalhousie University in Nova Scotia, Canada. She is a bioethicist who challenges us to think deeply about where health, science, and biotechnology are headed. Her research has addressed assisted reproduction, women's health, research ethics, many examples of public health policy and clinical practice, and genetic technology. Baylis's most recent book is titled Altered Inheritance, CRISPR and the Ethics of Human Genome Editing. It was published by Harvard University Press in the fall of 2019. She has been involved in international efforts to think through how genetic technologies could and should be regulated and imagine what meaningful public engagement would actually look like in relation to biomedical and biotechnology policy. For example, she serves on the World Health Organization's Expert Advisory Committee on developing global standards for governance and oversight of human genome editing. During the past year, she has also written widely on topics related to the COVID-19 pandemic, including immunity passports and other forms of immunity certification, the exclusion of pregnant women from vaccine trials, and policies related to vaccination priority groups. Baylis is a frequent guest on the CBC. She is a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Nova Scotia. She is a fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a fellow of the Canadian Academy of Health Sciences. In 2017, she was awarded the Canadian Bioethics Society Lifetime Achievement Award. She is a public intellectual in the truest sense. And I know that because her personal mantra is make the powerful care. I'm so delighted that she is here with us today.
I have a message here that says I can't screen share while another participant is sharing. So perhaps, Ellen, you could check your screen. How are we doing? Are you able to see my screen?
I am, Françoise, go right ahead.
Okay, thank you very much for that warm introduction, and apologies for this little technical glitch. It's one of the many things that we have to cope with in the time of COVID. Let me start by saying that it is really a true honor to have been invited to be the Wayne Morse Chair in Law and Politics this year. I can't tell you how excited I was when I was first approached, and I was very much looking forward to being able to come. And then the pandemic happened, and for a while, it sort of seemed maybe it would be possible still. But as the months passed, it became pretty clear that we were going to move this online. Anyhow, I'm sorry not to be there in person, but again, very honored to have this opportunity. So let me share with you some of my thoughts around what it means to live not only in the time of COVID, which is a true global pandemic, but to have that juxtaposed over some pretty significant technology, which also portends to change our world. So the title was, everything you wanted to know about designer babies and more. And I want to start by actually answering the question, what are designer babies? And the reason I need to do that is because it's actually contested. So some people refer to Louise Brown, and that's the first picture you see, 1978, the first child born through in vitro fertilization, as a designer baby. For those of you who aren't familiar with the technology, all you really need to know is that for the first time, human egg and sperm met outside of a dish, an embryo was created, transferred to a uterus, successfully implanted, and a child was born. It's now almost commonplace to talk about something like this fancy technology at a dinner party, and it's surprising how many people know someone who's either accessing the technology or is born of this technology. The second picture you see is actually a picture of Molly and Adam Nash. And this was the first savior sibling baby. And this is where a different technology is added to the technology of in vitro fertilization. So the embryo is made outside of the body. But then there is the capacity to remove one of the cells from that developing embryo and to look at it and to see certain traits. And in this particular case, they were looking for traits and against traits. And that's what makes this case particularly unique at the time in the year 2000. They were looking to find an embryo which would be HLA compatible with Molly Nash because Molly needed a transplant and didn't have a sibling. And they also needed a child that would not have the same illness as Molly, which is Fanconi anemia. And so they were looking through the embryos available in the Petri dish in the lab and were able to identify such an embryo and transfer it. Now, I've shortened the story. There were many attempts along the way, but what you have there is in vitro fertilization technology, and we add to that pre-implantation genetic diagnosis technology, and we have Adam Nash. The next occurrence is in 2016, and there you have a child whose name we do not know, because one of the things that we've learned over time is that it's really not good to be born with the whole world looking into your life for all of your life. And so now, in the context of these new technologies, there is an attempt actually to protect the children. This is Dr. Zhang, who is a person who did work in the United States. So the technical work was done in a lab in the US, but the embryo was taken to Mexico and implanted in a Jordanian couple who were at risk of having a child with a condition called Leigh syndrome. And here the technology is different. Again, you're starting with the egg and sperm outside of the body, but the egg has two components. So if you think about an egg that you recognize, like a chicken's egg, for example, you've got the yellow, the yolk, and the white. And there is DNA in both of those parts of the human egg. And the problem for this couple was faulty mitochondrial DNA, and that's the DNA that would be, say, in the white part of the egg. And so what they did in this case is they replaced that. And there you have another child born of what's referred to as mitochondrial donation. And the last case is Dr. He from China, and he gave birth. I was about to say he gave birth, but of course he didn't. A woman gave birth. He helped to create twins that were given the names Lulu and Nana, but those are in fact not their real names. They're just pseudonyms. And this is new technology using CRISPR. And that's actually going to be the focus of my talk. But the point I wanted to make is for you to see the evolution that has happened in what I would describe as a relatively short period of time, 40 years. And what I want you to understand is that from my perspective, not all of these babies are designer babies. I'm arguing that only the last two are designer babies, but that they're coming into being very much dependent on the technology that has been developed actually since the 60s. It's just that you only had a successful birth in 1978. And the reason I draw that distinction, and it's something I want you to hold on to for the rest of the talk, is that the first two instances, you're actually working with what is available in nature. And at most, you're making decisions about selection. In the last two cases, you're actually creating a being that would not otherwise have existed. So the human hand is involved in a very different way. And that's what gets you the designer baby. So that's what we're talking about. We're talking about future children where the human hand has been involved in making a child that could not otherwise have existed with that particular genetic complement. Now, CRISPR is an acronym. It stands for Clustered Regularly Interspaced Short Palindromic Repeats. That's a mouthful. We don't use it. Everybody talks about the technology in terms of the acronym CRISPR, and some people will talk about CRISPR-Cas9. I don't want to spend much time on the science because that's not what you need to understand in order to engage with the ethical, cultural, social, and political debates. All you need to really know is that you have two parts, the CRISPR and the Cas9. It's thought to be extremely precise and efficient in terms of making genetic changes. And basically, you have one part that takes novel DNA into the cell, takes it to the right part of the cell, and then you have another part which is represented there with the scissors, which is to make what's called a double strand cut. So you're cutting the DNA and either going to remove DNA, insert DNA, or actually just disrupt DNA. But you're making a change that is not something that's being done by nature. The human hand is involved. These are just two very quick images, if you will, that I want to share with you to show a little bit what that technology looks like. We have something called non-homologous end joining. And what happens is DNA breaks all the time. And when it does, the cell knows how to do that repair mechanism. And so in this context, what can happen is as the cell tries to repair itself, it can either insert new DNA in order to do the repair, or it can in fact delete DNA when it does this repair mechanism. The problem there is you can't really predict the kind of genetic change that is going to be made. And so you're really just looking at contexts where all you want to do is to disrupt the genetic material. What people are more familiar with is what's called homologous recombination, where you actually have the same thing happening. You're going to use your CRISPR-Cas9 to make a double strand cut, but you're actually bringing in what I've described here as a customized DNA sequence. And so you're taking that sequence into the cell and you're inserting it where you've made that cut in order, ideally, to make a genetic change. That's the end of the science. So for me, what's really important when I look at this kind of science, which some people think of as just really cool science, other people think of it as disruptive science. When I look at this kind of science, I think, how are we going to use it? And in order to answer that question, I have to answer a prior question. And it's the question I want to ask all of you. And this is the second thought that I want you to hold on to from this talk. What kind of world do you want to live in? Now, to understand the complexity of that question, I'm going to go back and make a couple of points. The technology that I have just shown you, CRISPR-Cas9, go in, cut DNA, delete a piece of DNA, insert a piece of DNA, etc., can be done in one of two kinds of cells that we have in our body. We have germ cells, which are our reproductive cells. So that's your egg, the sperm. It's the early embryo, but it's also the cells that make the egg and sperm. So those are called the precursor cells. So germ cells are your precursor cells. They are your gametes, your egg and sperm. They are the early human embryo. Those reproductive cells, if you tinker with them, if you change them, whatever change you make will be passed on to the next generation. And assuming that next generation reproduces, they will pass that change on. The very same kind of change in somatic cells, and somatic cells just means your body cells, any of your body cells, changes made in those cells will die when the organism dies. So they are not passed on to the next generation. So one thing to think about is, do you want to live in a world where we make changes to individuals who can consent to those changes? And if the changes do or don't work out at some level, it's constrained because the changes are happening in a person who will eventually die, as we all do. Or do you want to live in a world where we actually make changes? And if we think of those changes as positive changes, as corrections, that you want those to be passed on to the next generation. But then you need to think about the fact that maybe they're not positive changes. The other thing to think about is, what was the goal? What was the intent in making those changes? And these cluster under two broad headings. They're either health related, you're trying to offer a treatment, and there's lots of talk about perhaps being able to use this technology to treat patients who have devastating conditions that have a genetic basis. But there's also talk about being able to use this for non-health related reasons. And there we talk about those as enhancements. Now, in my own work, and I won't actually go into that today, I actually don't think that it's a very stark difference in many cases between what's going to be considered a treatment and what's going to be considered an enhancement. So when you think about those possibilities, it matters what kind of cells and what's your goal, what's your objective. I want to suggest to you that when you think about that, today we are in fact at a fork in the road. We actually have to make important choices. And one of the things I worry about is that we don't actually understand, or at least some of us don't understand, or some of us don't believe or disagree that we are at a fork in the road. And the reason it's important for me to describe this as a fork in the road is for people to understand we have very little experience as a species in turning around. We make a mistake, we just look for another fork in the road. But perhaps once we've made a mistake, we understand that we're at a fork in the road and we're trying to decide, do I go to the right? Do I go to the left? But you also need to appreciate that a fork in the road can also change and shift directions, right? And it can still be a fork in the road. And so we have to make choices. And one of the very stark choices we have to make is, do we want to live in a world that includes designer babies? Babies that would not have existed but for the human hand. And that's what I want to be able to unpack for you today so that you can have for yourself an answer to this question. So we have the prospect, the possibility of children made to order. Don't try to read that. You can't, I can't. It's really there just as a picture, an image. But it is actually real. What you have in front of you is an advertising that was in the newspaper in 1997. That's quite some time ago. 1997, you have this ad suggesting that heritable changes could be made. And on that list that you can't read, it makes reference to gender, to myopia, to stature, to eye color, premature baldness, obesity, addictive susceptibility, criminal aggressiveness, and the list goes on. Now, the interesting thing about that, for those of you who can see very well and you'd need special glasses, is what's in the bottom right-hand corner. This newspaper ad was actually provocative advertising in 1997 for the film Gattaca. But what I want you to know is that the bottom of that advertising actually included a phone number, and people called that number. And they called that number because they wanted that option of children made to order. Now, the thing I want to say very clearly, and it's only because many people in this debate refer to Gattaca when they talk about designer babies. And I just want to make the point that if you actually watch that film, and it is an engaging film, on my count, they're actually not designer babies. And they're not designer babies because, again, they're using technology of the day, which is actually about selection, choosing from a set of options that are already there in nature. The designer baby is something that is made. And that's an important difference. And that's the question I'm asking. Is that the world we want to live in? Now, in that context, it becomes really important to understand where are we today and how did we get here? I've shown you that the science is probably about 40 years. If you look at the ethics, you could also argue that it's at least that long, if not longer. But the narrow focus on CRISPR as the technology, which has really sort of ignited the imagination because it now seems possible in a way that it might not have before, actually is a much shorter story. It starts in 2012 with work that has just been awarded the Nobel Prize by Jennifer Doudna and Emmanuelle Charpentier, and it catapults into public consciousness in 2015. Now, these are science articles, but those science articles were reported in news media. And for the first time, there's this sense that something's happening in science. Something is burbling. And the reason is here you have two articles in the two widely acclaimed journals, Nature and Science, by well-respected scientists. And they're actually talking about the fact that we would modify the human germline. We're not talking about somatic cells. We're talking about making changes to the germ cells, changes that will be passed on to subsequent generations. And what you see here is an argument on one hand to say, don't do this. And on the other hand, we need a prudent path forward. A very clear instance of a fork in the road. Now, the interesting thing is these two articles come out within about 3 weeks of each other. And they come out in March of 2015 and then in April of 2015. And you should be asking now, why? Why all of a sudden is this a point of contention? And the reason is this scientist here, Dr. Huang from China, who has tried to publish his paper in Nature and in Science and been refused, ultimately publishes his paper in Protein and Cell. But what happens is that in that process, people are aware that he has done science that is about to be published, which documents for the first time having made changes to the human germline. So he did work in a lab with non-viable embryos, made manipulations to them, never transferred them, and then wrote a paper on this science explaining that it could be done. Many limitations, but it was possible. This person then spurred a global discussion, which actually starts in Washington, D.C. in December of 2015. It's the first international summit. And if you look closely, you should recognize a few people. Jennifer Doudna is there, Nobel laureate. David Baltimore is at the podium, Nobel laureate. And Eric Lander is also there. And I'm sure you might recognize a number of other people. But the point is, they come together, they host a meeting, there's debate, there's discussion. At the end of the meeting, it is said, and we can discuss who should be saying about what, which I think is an important point, but it is said that basic research in this area should continue. So in other words, the very research that was turned down by the scientific journals should continue. Research in a clinical context with the aim of using somatic genome editing to help patients should continue. But the idea that you would take the same technology done in the reproductive cells and use it to create a child is thought to be contentious. And this is the wording, this is the text that comes out of the statement made at the end of this meeting. And I want you to take away those words: safety and efficacy, broad societal consensus. And the idea there was, you don't go forward unless the science is ready. So you want it to be safe, you don't want to hurt people, you want it to be effective. You don't want to sell people a bill of goods, you have to know that it works. Broad societal consensus was about saying indirectly, this decision doesn't actually belong to the scientific community, it belongs to society. And it doesn't just belong to a majority. We have to find a way to have a conversation and to think about what it would mean for us as a society to make a decision about whether or not to pursue this science. Now, I want to take you very quickly through this idea of broad societal consensus because I think it's very important. I think it's had a bad rap from some people. It's something I've been writing about for a long time. I'm deeply committed to. And I want to say very clearly, it is not the same thing as broad scientific consensus. It is also not the same thing as broad societal debate. So what happened is that as there was some interest in this idea of broad societal consensus, a number of people tried to change the language and in so doing, change the meaning. I want to share with you very briefly what I think about this concept. And my work is grounded in work that was done by feminists in the 1980s. And these are women who came together at the Seneca Army Depot at that time in order to protest the deployment of cruise and Pershing II nuclear missiles to Europe. But these are women who don't have a lot in common other than this goal, which is in some sense what holds them together. But they have to then decide as a group, how are we going to make decisions? And they published a pamphlet, which I think contains tremendously important information about how do you have a conversation when you have people with disparate views and values. I'm going to name the elements. I'm not going to spend any time on them, but it is to say that you need all of these factors in order to move towards broad societal consensus. You need responsibility, which means that people are responsible for voicing their opinions. You can't just be there, you don't participate, and then you complain. No. Also, you need to think about self-discipline. And what that means is, if you're objecting, in what context, to what end, and can you do this in ways that are positive? Why? Because reasonable people can disagree. Respect, that's what comes from that view, from that starting assumption going into the conversation that other people's views are worthy of being listened to. Cooperation, we actually have a common goal, which is to get somewhere with respect to the issue under discussion and debate. And we understand that this will not be easy. I take these ideas and I hold them together because what I'm saying a broad societal consensus is about, it's about a process. It's about committing to a respectful way of engaging with people on a very difficult topic. And I've continued to write about that, but in my own work, I have bookended those 5 commitments with the idea of inclusivity, because I think we need to pay attention to who's participating in the conversation. And then the idea of benevolence, which I understand very much in terms of kindness, that if we understand it's going to be a struggle, there are people who will be hurt. We need to be respectful of those differences, and we need to find ways to continue the conversation. So what's important about this idea of consensus is it does not mean we all agree. So it's not 100% agreement, but it also doesn't collapse into majority rule. What it is consensus about is the fact that we all agree that we had a chance to explain our view, that it was heard, that it was understood, but that at the end of the day, it may not have been the one that prevailed. Now, what I think I want you to hold on to is 2015, extraordinary science, a coming together of some minds, a fair bit of criticism about who came together, but a statement to the effect that at least this controversial area of germline genome editing, for whatever purpose, therapeutic or enhancement, was controversial, and we needed to think about safety and efficacy. We needed to think about consensus. I would suggest to you that since then, there has been a lot of effort put into eliminating the idea or the commitment to broad societal consensus. Nobody's questioning that the science should be safe and effective, but other than that, there are different efforts to say, when are we good to go? One of the things that's important is that after this meeting in 2015, a committee of the National Academy of Sciences came together, and in 2017, they published this report. And what I think is important is that there's absolutely no mention of the idea of broad societal consensus. And there is a statement that this kind of research should be permissible, but only for compelling reasons. That's a dramatic shift, and it's a shift that happens in less than 2 years. So first of all, safety, efficacy, broad societal consensus. Now, safety, efficacy, and yes, you can go forward, but you better have a good reason. So fast forward, we're now in 2018. This is He Jiankui, whom I've already alluded to because I've told you that he contributes to the creation of twins that are supposed to have a genetic modification which makes them resistant to HIV. This information becomes public days before the second international summit, which is being held in Hong Kong. So whereas the first summit was organized in response to science, the second summit was happening in any case, and here a scientist's claims disrupt the meeting considerably, as you might imagine. Here's a slightly different group of people who come together. There's overlap between some of the members from the previous meeting and this one. You'll again see Jennifer Doudna, for example. You'll again see David Baltimore. And what's important here is the wording has changed. It's not safety and efficacy. It's not broad societal consensus. It could become acceptable in the future when we have the science up to speed. And because we've said it's acceptable, we then move to the claim it's time to define a rigorous, responsible pathway forward. And I want us to think about what that is. What is this translational pathway forward? And I want to say to you, one of the things that I find very interesting about the language is how it doesn't hold with my idea about the idea that we're in a fork in the road, because you could be at a fork in the road and either way could be forward, depending on how you want to think about it. And so here, there's really a very narrow understanding of what a translational pathway forward means. It means forward to getting into clinical trials where the goal, the objective would be to have children born with genetic modifications. In that context, they identify the following 5 elements of a rigorous, responsible pathway forward. In some of my other work, I actually unpack each of these claims, but today I only want to focus on one, this notion of a compelling medical need. What is a compelling medical need? Well, I'm going to suggest to you that it's not obvious. And one of the things that I think is really important is, how did we get to this idea of a compelling medical need? The very first time we hear anything like this is actually in 2017, in that first report I already spoke of. But what's interesting is they don't talk in that report about a compelling need. They talk about a compelling purpose, a compelling reason, a compelling technology, a compelling application. What's interesting is they don't apply it to the word need, but when they talk about these compelling purposes, these compelling reasons, they talk about the parental desire for genetically related children. And this is the beginning of important slippage in language between need and desire. I think all of you, if you stop and think for a minute, what you need can be very different from what you desire. I need to eat and drink. I might desire a coffee and a croissant, but if I'm offered an apple and a glass of water and I haven't eaten, that's what I need. So we need to think about what that means. Shortly afterwards, in July of 2018, we get a report that's now not based in North America, but coming from the Nuffield Council in the United Kingdom. And what's interesting is that they don't use the language of compelling purposes. They do speak directly about parental desires. But what's interesting is that they allow for the possibility that this could be an appropriate reason for moving forward, provided you pay attention to the welfare, the well-being of the children born. So what's interesting is you're getting a shift. In the first instance, we're saying what's really important is parental desire. In the second instance, we're saying, well, parental desire might be sufficient, provided that you have paid attention to the well-being of the children who will be born. And what's interesting is that when we look at Jiankui He and what follows, and I've put December 2018, though the meeting happens at the end of November, it's because much starts coming out in that following month. And one of the things that comes out is that when he's criticized for the science that he has done as a maverick, as a rogue, etc., he says, but I've followed the directives of 2017. It said for a compelling purpose, for a compelling reason. And in my country, in China, if you have HIV, your life is constrained in ways that you, in North America, perhaps do not understand. This was a compelling reason. And these parents wanted genetically related children. They could not otherwise have access to reproductive technology. I was doing exactly what you said ought to be permissible. The last document that I've put up there is the first time you actually see the words compelling medical need. And that is the language that is used after the meeting that takes place in November of 2018 and the report that gets published in January of 2019. And so within a very short period of time, we've moved from a compelling reason to a compelling need. And in both instances, what we're talking about is a parental desire. Parents who want children with specific traits. Now, one of the things that I think is really important, and I hope this here helps for people to understand, is what are we talking about? By and large, the examples given are these two cases. People imagine a couple where one partner is homozygous for a dominant disorder. The example given is Huntington's disease. And in this case, you're looking at a male who is affected. Because it's a dominant trait, it means every single child that that male produces with a female who is not affected will in fact be affected. So you'll see that each of the little eggs has a red dot. That means they will carry that trait. The other example given is where you have a couple where both partners are homozygous for a recessive disorder. And in that case, it's only when both couples have the illness that all of their children would also have the illness. And so the idea here is that these are couples who could not otherwise have healthy genetically related children. These are couples who could benefit from the kind of germline genetic intervention that is being proposed. Now, in the abstract, that sounds like a laudable goal, but I think it's really important in terms of background facts to understand how many couples are we talking about. And I'm only going to put up for you the example of cystic fibrosis, and this is only for the United States. We're talking one case every 15 years. Is this a compelling medical need? And do you answer that question for an individual couple or for society? And I think here it's really important for me to say it's really, really significant to think about this kind of question in the real world. One of the facts of the real world right now is that we are in a pandemic. We have 8 billion people on this planet that are in need of care and attention. And so we have to ask questions about what constitutes a compelling medical need. So why? Why are we going to pursue this technology? What's the goal? What's the objective? Many people, myself included, who have concerns about this have suggested that we need to stop and think. And the way we've tried to argue for that is to say we need to adopt a moratorium, and a moratorium specifically on heritable genome editing. And Eric Lander is the first author on this article. And what's important for you to understand is that this article, which comes out in March of 2019, is widely endorsed, supported by different parts of the world, different scientific communities, different patient groups, etc. But at the same time, several other people object. And I've only put up here the example of David Baltimore, Nobel laureate, chair of the first international meeting, chair of the second international meeting, etc. And this is his interpretation of what's happened. But I only want to draw your attention to the last line. To make rules is probably not a good idea. For me, that actually smacks of a fair bit of hubris. It's not a good idea. Why? Because you don't want to be subject to any rules? I think we need to think about what that means to say we don't need, or we don't want, or we don't think rules are a good idea. So think about what's happened in a very short period of time, and I worry about the limited time in which we've seen this kind of policy shift. 2015, it would be irresponsible. 2017, it should be permitted. 2018, it's time for a rigorous, responsible translational pathway forward. And then a small group of us saying in 2019, we need a moratorium. We need to stop and think about what it is we're racing towards. What's the goal? What's the objective? Now, please understand, a moratorium in a strict sense is not a ban. And in this paper, we actually argued for approximately 5 years. And it was to allow what? Time to stop and think. Time to address the question, why? Why do we want to do this? If we are at a fork in the road, how do we know if we're going in this direction or this direction? And we better have a reason. The next scientist to make a little bit of headway in this debate is Denis Rebrakov, who's in Russia. And what's interesting in this case is that he said he was going to do the same kind of research that Jean Curet had done, but that he was actually going to do this for women who were infected with HIV, not men who were infected. And when he got some pushback on that, he actually said, well, look, if I can't do HIV, it's okay. I've got some other plans. Dwarfism, deafness, blindness. And I'm not exaggerating. Those are his words. In that context, an international committee had been set up at the World Health Organization. You've already heard I'm a member of that committee. But that committee did say to the Director General, we have a problem here. We're trying to do some work, and we can't do work if there's going to be babies popping up all around us as we try to think through what the issues are. And here you see the statement there calling on other countries, because in fact, the World Health Organization has no authority. There is no global court in which it can sit or stage anything. And so it relies on moral suasion, but made a call to say, all countries, please do not continue down this path until we've had a chance to consider the implications. And to its credit, the Russian Ministry of Health responded and actually made specific reference to the WHO statement saying that they would wait until we had made some decisions. Interestingly, at the very same time that the WHO committee is doing its work, the National Academies of Sciences in the US and the UK together sponsored an international commission, and they have already issued their report that came out in September of last year. And you can see that again, they are talking about moving forward, but limiting it to cases of serious monogenic diseases. Now, one of the things that's been going on is that as this is happening, I and others continue to do our independent work as academics and researchers. And one of the things that I've just published with colleagues is a paper that looks at human germline and heritable genome editing around the world to say, look, we have all this controversy. We have people arguing about what we should or shouldn't do, whether or not we should go into the germline or whether or not we should just work in somatic cells. And the map that you see that's almost all red is a map which actually documents the policies on heritable genome editing for reproduction. And if you look at the map, at least for the countries where we were able to find information, it's almost all red. And so one of the things that's interesting is the people who are objecting to a moratorium, what are they actually objecting to? And I ask that question because everything that's red has either policies, laws, or research ethics guidelines that say this work should not happen. In the meantime, science continues, policy practice continues, and Jean Curet is in fact in jail at this time as a result of the work that he has done. And China has, in fact, most recently amended its law to make sure that this wouldn't happen in the future. And that law is to come into effect in March of 2021. So what have we done until this point? I've talked to you about what the science is of heritable genome editing. I've suggested that what we need is to invest time, effort, and energy to develop a broad societal consensus. Other people disagree. They're arguing for a translational pathway forward. And in that context, several of us have said, let's have a moratorium. Let's have a chance to talk through some of the ethical challenges. I'm going to take you through a few of the ethical challenges very, very quickly because I'm anticipating that that's where we might have a lot of conversation. And so this is going to be a very, very quick overview with very little detail. Ethical challenges, they come in many stripes and they actually affect many different parts of society. I want to emphasize, first of all, that there are harms to women and that we very rarely pay attention to this. We're so excited about designer babies. We're thinking about the babies. We're thinking about the prospective parents. But what you need to understand is to get the science to anything near safe and effective, you have to do a lot of research on human eggs. And those eggs are not sitting on shelves. You have to get them out of women. Egg retrieval is onerous. And if you are actually going to continue to do this science in a research context, you actually have to put those eggs back into women. We don't pay enough attention to the harms to women. The harms to prospective parents often don't get spoken about either because we imagine it's going to work. Well, what if it doesn't? What if there are unintended, unwanted, harmful consequences that are visited upon the children, and not by chance, but by choices that were made? There will be psychological repercussions, there will be social repercussions, there will be financial repercussions, and I could go on. But I've also put down, imagine if it is successful. What about the social pressure on everybody else who maybe doesn't want to reproduce in that way, using these high-tech interventionist methods? There are the harms to future children, and obviously it's going to start with unintended, unwanted, harmful consequences. But the very next thing you need to think about is that those consequences may not appear until after the child's reproductive age. And if that child has gone on to reproduce, you then have the possibility of multi-generational harm. You also have a harm that many people would sort of put under the banner of the loss of the right to an open future. If you know that your parents have planned and paid for you to have specific traits in pursuit of a specific kind of goal, and we're thinking here specifically of enhancements, how much freedom do you have? Whose life are you living? And I just want to highlight the last point, that some of this, and you'll have heard it in the kind of conversation, is that it could all feed into sort of a kind of naive biological determinism. And that sometimes doesn't get highlighted enough. There are harms to society. The biggest one would be a bifurcation into the haves and the have-nots, and a lot of people have written about that, in part as a function of differential access. But also, it's going to be in part because we anticipate increased discrimination, stigmatization, and marginalization. And you can already think back to what Dr. Rebekov said, right? Blindness, deafness. How do you get to say that those are things that need to be corrected? Maybe those are just different ways of being in the world. And so we have the prospect of this new kind of techno-eugenics that will be driven bottom up, not top down. So we don't, in fact, imagine that we would have a repeat of what some people refer to as either the history of eugenics in North America or the case, for example, in Nazi Germany. No, this will be lots of individual decisions made by couples bottom up, using technology to create children with specific traits that they think, hope, believe are going to be advantageous. There's potential harms to the gene pool as you, in fact, change the diversity of that gene pool. And I won't go into it now, but there could be problems both if you increase the diversity and if you decrease the diversity. There's problems of informed choice. Who gets to consent? Well, obviously, it's not going to be the embryo. Embryos don't consent to anything. The parents? But what about society? Don't we have a say if you're actually talking about changing the human genome? And I've written about this in terms of a metaphor saying that genome actually belongs to all of us. I also want you to think about the opportunity costs. If you're spending your time, talent, and treasure on this, what are you not spending your time on? Lots of money is being invested in this research. And it's going to be to develop a technology for all of us? I doubt it. There are more things I could say about embryo research and ethical issues there. I could talk about the threat to our common heritage. I could also spend more time on the question of transgression of divine or natural laws. But I want to bring this to an end so that we can actually have a conversation about some of these issues that I've raised. And I thought I would end with a couple of provocative statements. This is James Watson. He said, "People say we're playing God. My answer is, if we don't play God, who will?" I want you to think about that, and think about it in terms of humility and hubris, and think about it in terms of the fork in the road. Is that what's before us, the opportunity to play God? Many of these ideas I discuss in the book Altered Inheritance. But what I want you to understand is that part of the story I try to tell in that book is a story of power, wealth, competition, inequality, and exclusion. And for me, when I grapple with that question about what kind of world do I want to live in, it isn't this world. It's a very different world. It's a world that I hope is permeated with social justice, a world where ambition is collaborative, a world that values equality and equity and strives for fairness, a world, therefore, that looks towards inclusion, neighborliness, and community, and last of all, a world that understands solidarity. And I can't emphasize that enough in the context of the current pandemic. The ways in which many of us as individuals, as communities, as countries are behaving actually doesn't bear witness to any understanding of solidarity and what's needed to get us out of this pandemic. Let me end with a slide about the topic as opposed to the pandemic. I hope that the next time you see something in a magazine about genome engineering, eugenics, editing the future, that you have a few more ideas about what you'd like to contribute to that conversation. And maybe we can start that now with some questions. Thank you.
Thank you so very much, Françoise, for that extremely interesting and provocative talk. I think, my head is full of ideas about this fork in the road toward the question of what kind of world do we want to live in. We have a number of questions already, and I'm sure there will be more. So let me start with one of them. In recent years, new genome editing technologies have emerged that allow us to edit the genome of non-human animals with increasing efficiency. Given that much of the debate around these technologies is focused on the future of germline editing in humans, as you have discussed, I'm wondering, why is the human such a special subject on which to place our worries?
Well, that's a very important question. And I have to say, it's certainly a question that I have discussed with a number of colleagues, because there are important ways in which that's not true. But what happens is we always use ourselves as a reference point. And I think one of the things we need to actually think about is the ways in which that actually will not sustain our future. And the reason is we need to be thinking a whole lot differently about our interactions, not only with non-human animals, but also with plants and the environment more generally. So one of the things I talk about, a lot in this arena is that there are so many things we need to be thinking about in terms of the environment in which we find ourselves in. And what's happened is that we narrowly focus on genes as though we didn't understand or know anything about epigenetics, about the interaction between genes and environment. And I appreciate, in the context of today's talk, it might look like I too don't understand that, but I do. And I think that one of the things that's become really important is to think about the ways this same technology, CRISPR, in conjunction with other technologies, gene drive, is in fact being used in different animals, different species, and interestingly, always with a goal to making life for humans better. And I do think we need to think about that. And there's actually a fair bit of work that has been done by a number of colleagues just in the realm of research ethics generally, to say we always use different non-human animals as animal models for research for ourselves without any care or concern for the implications for that non-human animal. And in fact, many people will argue you ought not to do that research unless the non-human animal will also benefit from the knowledge that would be generated from this research. So I will say there is actually a lot of interest in using this technology in non-human animals, but almost always for the benefit of humans, or I would even go so far as to say the entertainment of humans, for example, with the idea of bringing back the woolly mammoth. So a very good question, and I think it behooves us to think differently about our relationships to each other and to other species and to the planet as a whole.
Thank you. We have a lot of other questions, so let me move on to one of them. When it comes to forging the kind of widespread societal consensus you talked about. How do we include smaller and less powerful countries in the conversation? And it did occur to me also, I think in line with this questioner, as you were speaking, that there has been, in the absence of that kind of societal consensus, we've already seen a pattern prior to CRISPR and germline editing of, kind of, shall we say, medical tourism related to reproductive technology and so on that might be relevant to this in the future.
So again, I think that's a very important question, and it certainly would be consistent with what I'm trying to do, is to create a world that is much more respectful and open of diverse views, diverse ways of knowing, diverse ways of being in the world. In the context of this work, I've actually been advocating very strongly for Indigenous peoples in all countries to have a say. And partly, one of the reasons I think that's really, really important is they have a different understanding of our relationship to Mother Earth. And we need to hear that in the conversation, and we need to be open to learning from that. Another thing, though, that I do need to say is that if you're struggling to put food on the table, this is hardly an important topic. And so we also then need to think about what is it that becomes important for people at a moment in time, and how does that connect back up to their lived experience? And I think we need to be attentive to that and respectful of that. One of the things that's really important is the language of science is English, and yet that's not the language of most people on the planet. We need to find ways of communicating differently. We need to find ways to use technology differently. And part of the reason I'm so committed to this idea that we need to find new ways to have these rich conversations is because we need to have it about things that are even more important than CRISPR technology. That's what I'm working on now, but we need to have that conversation in terms of the climate crisis. We need to have that conversation in terms of the pandemic. There's so much that we need to do differently, and that's about disrupting the power relations that are currently in play. Last comment with respect to the idea of medical travel, medical tourism. One of the things we have to pay attention to is when that's exploitative of individuals. And that can happen in the context of, what we've already seen in other areas of science with stem cell clinics offering interventions that are known not to be safe or effective. But we also need to think about what happens when the research and the research dollars only happens in certain parts of the world and doesn't actually provide an opportunity for other people who have other goals and objectives to actually develop science to help their community and respond to their priorities.
Thank you so much, Françoise. We have a question from one of our resident scholars this year, whom I believe you know, Leah Lowthorpe. She asks, can you speak to some of the other available options for having children for couples who are envisioned as candidates of germline gene editing for reproduction?
Absolutely. So one of the things that's important to understand in this debate is my starting point, and then I'll talk a little bit about the technology. So unlike other people, I do not believe that there is a right to have children. I understand that that's controversial. I understand that people disagree with me. I understand that if you want to have children and for any reason you cannot, that is very painful, very painful. And I would still, aware of all of that, argue that there's no right to have children and that we make a huge mistake in thinking that that is a right. Having children is a responsibility. It's a very big responsibility. And that's very important, that shift in language. It's not about rights, it's about responsibilities. And hopefully these are responsibilities that you willingly take on. And in that context, what I'm trying to say is that the focus is on the being that is being created, and that what it means to have children is to bring people into a loving circle. In that context, I argue that what matters is not the genetic relatedness, and that we make a mistake in thinking that that's what's important about having a family. And so I think you can think about all kinds of alternatives that are available. And one of them, quite frankly, is child-free living. And I say that only because there are people who have learned that they are infertile and presented with that, find other ways of enjoying children. and accept that that's not going to be a part of their life. But for those who do still want to have children, there is the option of adoption. It can be difficult, it can be expensive. But one of the things I find interesting is what people are willing to argue for in, for example, countries that have systems that will pay for this technology, this in vitro fertilization, for example, but that won't pay for the cost of international adoption. Well, why is it okay to pay for a technological solution, but not a social solution, especially in a context where there are lots of children who need families? Beyond adoption, there are ways in which you could use technology that does exist. So some of the examples there go back to the in vitro fertilization. If it is the case that your genetic material has, in the DNA, a specific genetic illness that you would like to avoid passing on to your children, you could in fact use donor gametes. We do that in other contexts. That would be an option here. There is also, if you think about the second example I gave of pre-implantation genetic diagnosis as a technology, you could use that as well. You could, in fact, create your own embryo using your gametes. And in certain cases, if you think back to the image I showed you about the couple and the 4 embryos, I showed you the examples where all 4 embryos were going to be affected. But there are many other genetic diseases where not all 4 embryos would be affected. Maybe 1 out of 4 would be affected, or 2 out of 4 would be affected, or maybe they wouldn't be affected, meaning they would have the illness, but they would just be carriers. And so you could use that technology of genetic selection to choose and transfer an embryo that would not have the genetic illness that you're trying to avoid. I didn't go through that in the talk because I jumped to the very end to try to make the point that there really is only a very, very small group of people for whom there is no other alternative in terms of a technological response, and for whom the claim is made that heritable human genome editing is the only way for them to have 2 things: healthy children and children that are genetically related to them. And I want to support the goal of having healthy children, but I also want us to problematize what it is we think healthy children means, because I think we have different ideas along a spectrum. And I, as I said, want to contest the idea that what's important about having a family is a genetic tie. And I will insist on this point because if we go back to that kind of thinking, we're actually undoing a lot of progress that we have made over the last 30, 40 years to understand families differently. What happens if I've adopted a child that's not my real child, that's not a real family? If I have a partner who, has a prior family and we now start our family, are our respective children not our family? If I'm in a same-sex relationship and I could not have had a child before with my partner, but now I'm able to use technology in different ways to achieve that, are we not a family? So I think it's really important for us to think not only for this technology, but what it is we're saying socially when we make the claim that it is a compelling medical need. For me, it doesn't rise to the need, and it isn't a right.
Here's another question about what might happen to entirely supersede the question of a compelling medical need. Technology commonly has a history of becoming less and less expensive and more commonly available over time. This leads me to believe that people will make use of this technology regardless of rules and regulations. And I think this probably refers to the moment in your talk when you were describing a kind of bottom-up techno-eugenics, where because of commercialization, the use of this kind of technology becomes a matter of, or is widely perceived as a matter of consumer choice. How do we as a society, presuming that may happen, how do we as a society relate to the children who will be born as a result of this technology?
Well, I think that this is going to be sort of a really difficult way to sort of answer the question, partly because I want to believe that it's not inevitable. Though I have, for those of you who know some of my work, I have actually written on the inevitability of genetic enhancement technologies, but I've presumed that inevitability because I've assumed that we aren't willing to call into question things like capitalism, things like rugged individualism, autonomy being the only ethical value or principle that we want to defend. And the reason I want to say that is because I do think we are at a fork in the road, and I do think it's possible to make different choices. And the issue of money isn't just what's it going to cost at the end of the day, it's who's going to invest the money in the first instance. This is extremely expensive science. Should our tax dollars be going to pay for this science, or should this just be philanthropists who are paying for it? I'm also not convinced that you're going to see the same kind of decrease in choice that people speak of or anticipate. I think we've already seen that start to turn around with technology. So yes, I remember the days when computers were very expensive and now they're less so. But there kind of comes a price point where nobody wants to go below that price point. And so they just keep adding on things that you don't actually want. And so I worry about what that would look like if we applied that reality to the technology, where you can't actually buy the base model of anything anymore because it doesn't fit with the way capitalism works. You can't allow it to go below a certain price point. But I also think that when we think about it in those terms, we're really thinking about Western ways of seeing and understanding the world and how it works. And I'm not sure that the world we live in today and that the way we're thinking through the problems today are going to be available to us in 20, 30, 40 years. And so I think we need to exercise the moral imagination in ways that are challenging for us. We have lots of ways, for example, of imagining the end of the world, the big apocalypse. We've got tons of movies that show us what that looks like, and then we can think about ways to try to avoid it. But we actually haven't had that conversation around the end of capitalism. What does that look like? Is it even possible? I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm mindful of what happened in 2011 with Occupy. I'm mindful that everybody today knows what the phrase means when you say the 99% and the 1%. And all of us are the 99%, in case you weren't sure about that. But the reality of it is, I actually don't think it's sustainable. I don't think you can have what we have seen happen. And again, I'm returning to current work I'm doing on the pandemic, where the people who were already at the top of the pile are flourishing, are making billions more dollars. And at the bottom of the pile, you have people who are suffering and cannot put food on the table. I am very enamored by some of the ideas of Michel Foucault. And one of the things he talks about is power. And when he talks about power, he says, if you want to understand power, don't look to the king, look to the masses, because the king only gets to be king while the masses will support the king. And I think right now, it's not clear to me that we're not on the verge of another kind of major upheaval. I'm sure the people who lived through the Industrial Revolution didn't quite know or understand what it would look like years after. And I think we are truly living through a moment in time where we have to make decisions about what's important. And sadly, right now, I think we're failing. Probably wasn't the answer you expected.
I have another question from another of our resident scholars, Arafat Valiani, who asks about gene editing. As you know, CRISPR has been used to create interventions in sickle cell and other diseases. Do you think that there are biological risks in terms of catalyzing mutations through editing for these diseases, which are very difficult to live with? Are there risks about which we are not aware because we haven't had time to study side effects of certain interventions in gene therapy?
So one of the things that's really important to understand is many people are doing work using CRISPR in somatic cells, body cells, in order to be able to help people who have sickle cell disease. That is ongoing research that is happening right now. That research has a number of potential risks, as does any research right now with CRISPR. And I didn't go into great detail about it, so let me do that now. One of the things that can go wrong is, if you remember the technology as I described it, you're going into the cell, you're making a cut, what we refer to as a double strand break, and then you're either going to insert or delete material. One of the things that can happen is you can have what's called an off-target effect. In other words, you sent in the piece of DNA or you made a cut and it happens in the wrong place. And then all kinds of things could go wrong. Alternatively, you could have an on-target effect, meaning you got to exactly the right place and you made the cut and you inserted the material, but you had an effect that you didn't anticipate, understand, etc. There's worries that you could, in fact, for example, cause cancers. There's worries that you could have unintended effects on other chromosomes. So the reality of this is that, yes, there's all kinds of things that can go wrong. The history of gene therapy includes many things that have gone wrong. The hope is that these trials would be well designed, that considerable attention would be paid to issues of safety, and that if something did go wrong, that it would be in a very small number, it would be constrained, and that the people who participated would have understood that it was research. Research means we don't know. Research means we are trying to get to knowledge production, and we're inviting you to participate in that research with us. But the thing I want to underline, having been given the example of sickle cell disease, is that is a very significant illness for the Black community, the African American community, specifically in the United States, but also globally. It's a huge challenge for Africa. If this technology is successful, will Africans benefit? They bear the burden of this disease.
Another question, this one from Marcy Darnovsky, who I believe is at the Center for Genetics and Society. And she asks you to talk a little bit more about ways to resist the push forward with heritable genome editing. You had that chronology showing the kind of slippage from the broad societal consensus to the scientists saying, you know, let's go with it. So I think she's wanting you to address that.
Well, one of the things, you know, to be mindful of is that I think as more and more information becomes available, that hopefully the conversation will shift. One of the things that's really important when you're having any kind of ethics debate is to actually have access to facts, right? So good ethics depends on good facts. And I do think that this is an area in which there's been a lot of enthusiasm for what some people perceive as cool science without actually having enough information about the facts. So some of those facts are actually trickling out after people have made various pronouncements about what should or shouldn't be happening. And in a context also where I think there has been some effort to align some of the values that are underpinning some of the recommendations that people are making. So for example, I think I alluded to that when I very quickly you know, showed you those two maps of the world. That's a paper that's available free online. And in fact, Marcy is one of the co-authors. But what those maps show you is what is the policy landscape. So one of the things that was very interesting is that in the discussion up until this point, people were making vague statements about, you know, many countries think this, many countries think that. And yet when you actually go and look for the information, it's like, oh my goodness, nearly half of the world actually has policies in place that say you shouldn't do this. And so one of the things that becomes important then is to understand, well, how did other ideas get traction if actual, you know, governments in countries have said that this is not an arena that we want to move in? And I think one of the things that's interesting and important is you have very powerful personas who advance a particular idea. I found it very interesting to think about the juxtaposition again of those maps to say, there are people that don't want a moratorium. And so then I look at that map and I think, okay, which countries are you not wanting to have a moratorium? And that then brings us back to the question of medical travel. Is it that you don't want a moratorium in a country that isn't your own country because your country already has a law that says you can't do this? and you want to be able to travel somewhere else to do that. And so I think that's really important. I think we will also learn more about different challenges with the kinds of genetic manipulations that people are trying to make, even in the context of working narrowly with somatic cells and in the hope of treating patients. This is very complicated science. When CRISPR came along, everybody said it's cheap, it's easy, it's effective. People started saying, everybody can do this in their garage. Well, no, it's cheaper and easier relative to what was otherwise available, the science at the time, zinc finger nuclease, talons, et cetera. But it's not easy. It's complicated science, and many things can go wrong. I think, we need to pay attention to that. I also think, quite frankly, we need to think about the money that we invest in science and whether we're answering the right questions. I cannot emphasize enough the importance of thinking about the opportunity costs. And I think that that is going to be front and center for the next little while, partly because countries around the world have invested so much in caring for their populations in the context of the pandemic that I think there will be questions about where do you spend your next science dollars. So I really do think that we are in a period of change. And I think that hopefully, will be reflected in subsequent conversations. And lastly, I think many more people, as they become aware of what is or is not possible, have an opinion and they want to share it. And I think people are claiming that space, perhaps in a way that they didn't before. I think there's increasing questioning around issues of trust and issues of deference. And I think that people are willing to say, I think I can understand the issues and I have an opinion too. And I too want to weigh in. So, I'll say again what I said before. The questions before us are too important to leave to the scientific community. And so part of my goal or objective is to spread information so that people can, for themselves decide which way they want to go. But to do that, you have to have some basic facts. And most importantly, you have to understand where to fork in the road. And when you do that, then I want you to ask for yourself and answer the question, what kind of world do you want to live in? And if I can, I'll tie it one more time back to the pandemic, because I think it's actually the same question. I feel like I could write a book on the pandemic and it would be exactly the same book. It's just I would use COVID-19 as the example instead of CRISPR. And I think in that context, what I want to say is, I've heard so many people say, I can't wait to get back to normal. I can't wait to get back to the life I once had or knew. And I want to say that for many people, that life wasn't so good. And so maybe what they're hoping for is that when we come out of this, we're actually going to move towards a better life, something that would be more fair, more just, more inclusive. And I have hope for that. I think that's possible.
I think we have time for perhaps one or maybe two more questions. Here's one that's a little bit provocative. It strikes me that many of the arguments you are making were made with regards to IVF, in vitro fertilization, 40 years ago, but our worst fears have largely not played out. Why do you think human genome editing and MRT, which I believe is myocardial replacement therapy, are that different? So that's the question.
I think there are a number of ways in which it is different. And one of the things that I think is really important to think about there is what I tried to start with, the difference between selection and design. The minute you move to design, you can think of this as a wonderful opportunity to build anything. But then I think you really have to think about, what does that mean? So for example, to this point, I have imagined that we're actually, when we send in new DNA, that it's going to be what I would call, or scientists would call, reference DNA, meaning it's DNA that exists out there in the world. But what if you can just make it? So one of the ideas I explore in my book is to say, in the abstract, if I'm going into a conversation, discussion, debate about this, I have to start with an open mind that says, I could be wrong. Anybody else in the room might have a really good idea. And so one of the ideas I play with is, I'm worried about the climate. I'm worried about environmental disasters. I'm worried about the prospect of nuclear war. I'm worried about the fact that we may not have clean water, and I go on and on. And so I say, wouldn't it be a great thing if we could use this technology to make us have gills, or to make us have lungs that can breathe polluted water, polluted air, maybe water too. But I think, could we make those modifications because, we want to survive? And then I ask questions, is it so important that we survive? Maybe Darwin's right and we're supposed to, in fact, die off and we're just speeding it up. But if you have the kind of hubris that I have heard some people express, you might say, no, it's really important that this species survive. And so, yeah, we should start making ourselves be different. Or alternatively, say, you know what, we've made such a mess of this planet. Let's just get off of it. And let's modify ourselves to be able to live in outer space in some kind of either spaceship or some other planet, et cetera. And so these are not conversations that people had when they were thinking about in vitro fertilization. And this is not a case where you can say, look, what's happening is that we have a biological blockage in a woman's tubes and we can't open that up. So we're just doing an end run around a problem, which is a blockage in the tubes. But since then, we've seen the technology be used for multiple different things, but we've also seen a huge amount of exploitation. So yes, on the one hand, we haven't seen, or some people would argue, we haven't seen some of all of the horrors that were predicted. But I would suggest to you that we have seen many things that are not acceptable. We have seen the exploitation of women in other countries for the benefit of rich women in high-income countries through practices like contract pregnancy. We have seen harm done to young women who are at university as students who have suffered the consequences from becoming egg donors. And actually, many of them are not donors, they're sellers. And so we've created a market in the body, which didn't exist before. And I think there's huge issues that I would be happy to talk about sometime there in monetizing the body in that way. But I also think that we need to understand that as we've done this, we've failed to name certain harms along the way, and we failed to pay attention to the people who are being hurt. If I go back to, in vitro fertilization, we now have a very expensive and I would argue mostly useless insurance policy that we offer to young women when we tell them it's important to freeze their eggs. So there are lots of things that happen with in vitro fertilization technology, which ultimately I think are harmful either for individuals or for society in terms of having normalized certain kinds of practices that I think of as exploitative. So in response, I guess I don't accept that IVF was fine and we didn't have any of the dire consequences that people predicted. We certainly didn't have some consequences people predicted. We have had other consequences people did predict, and we had consequences that people didn't anticipate. With this technology, I think the same will likely be true. There will be some things that people, are worried about that will not come to pass. There will be other things people worried about that could come to pass, and there will be all kinds of things we didn't anticipate that could ultimately be harmful. So I do think it is disruptive technology. It is different from technology that solely involves choosing between that which is otherwise an option, and that once you take on design, you have no idea what some person will think about designing.
We have just a few minutes left, but there is one question that I think is so important that I'm hopeful you'll be able to address it quickly.
I'll try.
Yeah. Can you please give us a sense of how contemporary research on CRISPR technology and its implications for designer babies, as you've talked about, does or does not link up with work addressing the reemergence of new and old forms of scientific racism in genomics?
So I think scientific racism is a huge problem, and I actually wondered about whether or not I should put that in this talk when I put up the slide of Dr. Watson, because he is known to have had both eugenic and racist views with respect to what can or cannot be found within our DNA. One of the things that for me becomes really important here is to, again, understand that genes function in environments. And this, I think, is one of the things that sadly and indirectly, I know it happens, in some of the talks that I give, that we do not pay sufficient attention to that interaction. And so we think that we will find a gene that will either be a very positive outcome or a very negative thing in terms of what we go looking for. And I think what we really need to ask ourselves questions about is, what questions do we think are important and worth investigating in the first place? What biases do we bring to the naming of that question and to the answers that we can see, right? In terms of what our goals and objectives and orientation are. But I think what's most important to understand is that racism exists, and it exists in this arena as it does in many other arenas. And the only way to, I think, combat it is to name it and to confront it. And in that sense, hopefully, there are enough people around who are like-minded that you can, in fact, have an appropriate social response to unacceptable views and behaviors.
Thank you so much, Professor Françoise Baylis, for this extremely interesting and provocative talk on an incredibly important subject. Thank you, everybody who attended. We have a number of other public events coming up, which will include Françoise Baylis. Several of them will. If you don't know about them and would like to check them out, please just visit the Wayne Morse Center website. There is information about each of them and registration links. Thanks again to all of you for attending today.
And again, if I can, I just want to say very publicly how proud I am to have had this opportunity to be the Wayne Morse Chair in Law and Politics. It was a wonderful invitation, and I hope the whole month will be a wonderful experience for both of us. But thank you again. It was lovely.
Well, we're delighted, and thank you. We look forward to the many events in the next month.
And
Bye.
I'm just sorry for the audience that I can't see you.
Bye, everybody. Hope to see you at another remote event soon.